Hello to everybody. If you don't know me, I am Cari Reinert. I graduated last year from TAMS. I'm studying international political economy at UT Dallas. And eventually I really want to be a professor who does research on like the economic and political side of the space industry. I'm really interested particularly in the connection between like the private space industry and public entities like NASA, Roscosmos. I don't know if I'm saying that right, honestly. I apologize if I mispronounce anything. But yeah, that's kind of, I guess, a summary of my interests. So this presentation is going to be more of like a historical / political presentation about like where the space industry kind of came from and where it's going, as opposed to something where I'm like, here are all the parts of a rocket. So just to give you, I guess, something to kind of expect. First, I have a like presentation. I think it'll last maybe like 30 minutes. I'm not entirely sure. But after that, we'll have time for some like questions or just discussions if anyone just wants to talk about space. So with that said, I will get started. The biggest part of my presentation is about like the history of the space industry, especially like the Apollo programs. So yeah. Cool. So, I mean, obviously everybody, like when everybody thinks of space, people usually think of like the moon landing back in like the late 1960s. But there's actually a lot more that went into the space race than what most people initially think about. So people had been talking and writing about going into space and becoming astronauts and doing all these really cool things actually for decades before the US or the Soviet Union ever really began their space programs. So these are some like really, really old science fiction novels. The Struggle for Empire, I think it was actually written in the 1800s. And it is regarded by some as like the first space opera. And then these other two are just covers of other kind of historical space operas that happened about like intergalactic travel. So I think it's really interesting that people were thinking about going into space and exploring and thinking about all of the conflicts that could occur way before we even like thought it was possible to like actually launch rockets into space. Cool. So here's just a quote that I really like from JFK that kind of explains the US's motivation for going to space in the first place. As many of you know, the space race came about because of the Cold War. And so like during the Cold War, there were two kind of global hegemons, the US and the Russia, that had emerged after World War II. And they were having kind of a technological arms race on many different fronts. You know, they were having kind of a nuclear arms race. They were competing scientifically for a few different discoveries. And I guess the space race kind of became the face of that technological competition. So yeah. JFK is also credited as the first president to really want to go to space, but interestingly enough, the administrations before him actually worked with NASA to try to develop a plan. So JFK is more famous because his rhetoric is what kind of emphasized all of that. So don't give all the credit to him. Cool. So now looking at the Cold War, the thing that really kind of sparked it off was Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1 was the first artificial satellite, and it was launched by the Soviet Union in October 1957. And the reason that that sparked a kind of space race is because people in the United States saw that and they were like, uh-oh, if the USSR can launch like objects into orbit, then they might be able to launch weapons into orbit. You know, they might be able to launch nuclear weapons, especially. So the US kind of became involved partially from like national security interests, partially from like an egotistical perspective. We wanted to be seen as the country that was big and powerful and great and the most scientifically advanced on Earth. So all of those factors kind of combined led to the creation of NASA in 1958. And ever since then, the US and Russia, or the Soviet Union, I guess back then, have been launching things into space. So the Soviet Union actually had a really, really big lead on us at first. They launched the first animal into space in November 1957. So they launched a satellite in October, and then literally the very next month, they decided, oh, let's launch an animal, and they launched a dog. I think her name was Laika, and she came back alive. So um, one big difference between the US and the Soviet Union is that, especially in the beginning, the Soviet Union was willing to take more risks. They didn't tend to like run as many of their like as many practice launches or operations, and so I think they actually had a lot of animals die when they were first like launching things into space, whereas the US, I think, took a little bit more of like a cautious approach to all of that. So yeah, the reason we're having this webinar today especially is because we are 3 days away from April 12th. April 12th is known as the International Day of Human Spaceflight because in 1957, oh wait, I think that date is wrong. It should be 1961, oops. Anyway, in 1961, Yuri Gagarin launched into space, and he was the first human man to orbit the Earth. And it was a successful mission. Obviously, he came back alive, so that's good. But that especially really kind of lit the fire under NASA, because they were like, oh man, they're sending animals into space, they're sending men into space. And so NASA was right on the tails of that, and they actually sent, well, oh wait, no, that's the wrong slide. Anyway, they sent a man into space right after Gagarin, I think on May 5th. So less than a month later, the US was also sending men into space. In 1965, they had their very first spacewalk, or like the Russians did, by Aleksey Leonov. And that was pretty significant because it was one of the like first big tests of our capabilities when it comes to like spacesuits. So that was really cool. It captured a lot of the world's attention. But yeah, so most of the achievements on this slide were achieved by Russia, and I just did that to show you how like kind of far behind we were from Russia. We weren't like super far behind, but they were getting all of the news, they were getting all the attention. If you see on this slide, these are like issues of newspapers that Russia made, or the Soviet Union. If I say Russia and I'm talking about like 1960s, just assume I mean the Soviet Union. But yeah, so that competitive spirit inspired NASA to create eventually the Apollo missions. But before the Apollo missions, we actually had two other space programs that not a lot of people know about. So the first spaceflight program that we ever had was called Project Mercury. It was created in 1958, pretty much as soon as NASA was created, and it ended in 1963. And their mission was to put a man in orbit and to return safely. Their goal was to do that before the Soviet Union, but obviously the Soviet Union succeeded by like a month. NASA ended up with 6 successful flights by astronauts. So did the Soviets. So in terms of like the amount of people that both countries sent to outer space, it was equal. However, the Soviet Union ended up having a lot more, I guess, like time in space, and their accomplishments were a little bit like better. So, yep. Oh yeah, and the name of the guy from the US who went into space was Alan Shepard. So that's Project Mercury. Project Gemini came right after. It's a little bit less interesting of a project to like look into because they were mostly just kind of testing out their capabilities. But I think it's really cool that in just a span of like 1 year, they sent 10 crews to space with 16 astronauts. Like, to me, that's just insane that they managed to like hold that many missions in such a short period of time, especially like if you think about today, the pace that like space travel is kind of going at. It's just, it kind of shows the pressure that NASA was on and the pressure that people were placing on NASA to send people into space and to send people eventually to the moon. Yeah, they were pretty serious about it. And so, of course, the Apollo missions were announced in July 1960. Um, they, oh, I also messed up the date on this one. Apollo 1 was built in 1967, I believe, not 57, because they couldn't have built Apollo 1 without NASA. Sorry about that. But the Apollo missions, like I said, were announced in July 1960. They were conceptualized before JFK was even elected, because JFK was elected in November 1960. However, like I said earlier, JFK was responsible for kind of a lot of the rhetoric that led to the American public kind of uniting behind NASA and really paying attention. So yeah, so the first crewed flight was called Apollo 1. It was built in 1957. They were doing some like routine testing, and a fire broke out, but there was an error where like the crew members weren't able to get out in time. And so all three members ended up asphyxiated, which was a really big blow to the Apollo program, as you can kind of imagine. You know, if your country is like, oh, we're going to compete with Russia, we're going to send people to space, and then the very first mission ends up pretty much blowing up and killing people, that's not a great start. But I think that's actually that one of the most inspiring thing about studying the history of Apollo is realizing that, like, wow, even though the first mission was literally like a dumpster fire, like they kept on like persevering and they kept on with the missions. So yeah, Apollo 1 is something interesting to kind of look up if you have free time. So another thing about the Apollo missions, in terms of the politics at the time, JFK was assassinated, and after he was assassinated, his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, kind of took up the mantle of the space program, and the space program kind of became, in a way, a tribute to JFK and all of the rhetoric that he was talking about. So that kind of JFK's legacy really added to the urgency that people felt that we needed to send people to the moon. A lot of experts say that if JFK hadn't died, then we probably would have eventually made it to the moon, but we probably wouldn't have made it so soon. So that's kind of an interesting little tidbit. But I guess talking about the structure of the Apollo missions in general, there were three major types of missions. There were uncrewed Earth orbiting missions, which were Apollo 4, 5, and 6. They actually did not have an Apollo 2 or 3 because I think, I could be wrong on this, but from what I've read, the widows of the Apollo 1 astronauts wanted mission 2 and 3 to kind of be they wanted it to start off on 4 so that mission 2 and 3 can be kind of used to like mourn the death of the astronauts. So I think I said that a little more jarbled than it really is, but anyway, that's why there's no mission number 2 or 3. They also had crewed Earth orbiting missions. The Apollo 7 was the very first mission after Gemini to send humans to space. And then Apollo 8 was the very first mission where man was sent to orbit the moon. And that was a success. So that success paved the way for all of the following Apollo missions, including Apollo 11, which, as you guys probably know, was the actual mission where man made it to the moon. So here's kind of a timeline of all of the missions. As you can see, the dates of all of the missions are incredibly, incredibly close together. It's basically from 1967 to 1972, which is only 5 years. So that many missions in 5 years, that's impressive. And it was also incredibly expensive, which kind of led to the demise of the Apollo program eventually. Back in these times, NASA, I think, made up about 5% of the US federal budget. And since the 1990s, NASA has never made up more than 1% of the budget. So it's kind of interesting to compare how much we spent on going to space back then versus how much we're spending now. Cool. So kind of talking more about the notable missions, or the ones that we all remember. I've talked about Apollo 1 and Apollo 8 and 11. Apollo 13 was actually a really, really important mission in our nation's history, because that was a mission that ultimately failed. But the crew ended up surviving, so nobody died. But it was kind of a shock to our country, because since we had had so many successful Apollo missions, people kind of thought, oh, you know, like we're almost like invincible, we're doing great, we have so much momentum. And then Apollo 13's failure kind of shocked people back into reality, into realizing the real danger of traveling to space. So after Apollo 13, there were several other missions. Most of them were missions for scientific purposes. So astronauts collected soil samples on the moon. They conducted experiments. I think on the last mission, they actually brought like 5 mice and ran experiments with mice. So the Apollo missions after Apollo 11, you know, because Apollo 11 was the big moment where, yeah, we beat the Soviet Union to space. We finally made this very first like milestone. And so after that, a lot of the appeal for exploring outer space kind of, I guess, diminished, especially after the tragedy of Apollo 13. So that's why you see after that, most of the missions focused on like scientific observations and experiments. Until Apollo 17, which was the last one. So a lot of people wonder, like, we were doing so well, how come we kind of just like stopped sending humans to the moon? Well, there's a lot of like reasons to that. I think the primary one is that the space program was really expensive. Like I said, during the time of the Apollo missions, we were spending about 5% of the US federal budget, which is a pretty big chunk. And once we had kind of beat the Soviet Union in going to the moon, a lot of that incentive was kind of gone. You know, the next frontier that people could think about was Mars. But back in the late 1960s and early 70s, it was kind of seen as a foolish goal, because we didn't have the technologies to really go there. I mean, even today, we still have so much to learn before we're able to like put humans on Mars. So I guess the closest thing they did to pursuing more of that is launching the Viking like mission, which touched down on Mars in 1976, and it was the first like human created device to reach Mars. So after the Apollo mission, NASA kind of changed its focus. They kind of expanded their scope to, I guess, atmospheric sciences too, and other things that impact people on Earth. And NASA also focused more on sending unmanned spacecrafts to other planets and to explore the universe. So their function kind of switched from being an organization that was a symbol of national pride and I guess like scientific achievement, to being more of like the nerdy NASA we know today, you know, where people like, where they have their goal is to kind of obtain information about the universe and pass it on to other people. So another thing that happened is that administrations changed. And as different presidents kind of came into office, their priorities changed. And that's actually something that affects space travel today. It's really difficult to get the public sector to really have really big accomplishments in space, because administrations change so often that can like really, really change budgets, especially since it takes so long to develop like space programs. So I think it's interesting looking at why the Apollo program ended, especially as a lot of people are now kind of talking about revving back up and going to Mars, because our motivations back then were very different from how they are now in some respects. Cool. So that's the history part of it. A very, very cool thing to study about space, and there's so much that I didn't even have like time to get into, but there's a lot of good movies and documentaries. If you haven't seen Apollo 11 or Apollo 13, oh, they're wonderful movies. They're classics. But yeah, so now I'm going to talk more about competition and how competition between like countries kind of turned into cooperation, and how that change in mindset has kind of led to a changing space industry. So one thing that I really like to study is international agreements and international organizations and how those kind of play into how, I guess, national organizations conduct space travel. So these are, I guess, just some like really important dates that are important to know about when you're looking at the international nature of space exploration. So in 1958, the same year NASA was created, obviously a very, very important year for the history of space, was the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs. I believe that this office was kind of developed in coordination with COPUOS, which was founded the next year. It's the Committee for Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Anyway, so these two offices are the primary ones used for, I guess, developing international space policy. And both of these kind of, especially COPUOS, it's used as kind of a forum for nations to come together and talk about, I guess, what they're doing in space. So COPUOS hasn't actually passed that many treaties or agreements. The most notable one that they passed was in 1967, the Outer Space Treaty. And the Outer Space Treaty is really important. I think all major like space players or space countries that are involved in that have signed on to it. Some of the provisions included in the Outer Space Treaty are that no nukes are allowed to be sent into space. So kind of one of the big goals of establishing committees like this was to make sure that space was being used for peaceful purposes. A lot of leaders were worried about the space race turning into like an arms race just in space. And so that was like one of the biggest focuses of the Outer Space Treaty, and it's one of the reasons that it got so many signatories and sponsors and why it ended up passing. But some other important provisions that we still use today are that no state can claim sovereignty over celestial bodies. So states, basically the rule is that if you're a country, you can create your own spacecraft, you can create your own technology and send it into space. And you can use it for like scientific purposes, but you're not allowed to land on, say, Mercury and be like, oh, Mercury is the planet of the Republic of Germany. You know, you can't say that. So most of the rules introduced in the Outer Space Treaty are rules that we kind of take for granted or assume today, but it was really important for them to be written down and agreed upon by a lot of the parties. So that's the Outer Space Treaty. Another treaty that's really important, and I guess probably one of the most recent notable ones, is the Moon Treaty. And the Moon Treaty is notable primarily because it was a ginormous failure. So the Moon Treaty was a treaty that was written in 1979, and it sought to kind of better regulate commercial space. And so some of the provisions, they like wanted to establish a global framework, and they wanted to make sure that resources gathered in space were regulated by some kind of a global entity. And they also, I think the Moon Treaty mostly just kind of came up with a bunch of like regulations. Their goal was to kind of expand upon the purpose of making space like available to everybody. The Outer Space Treaty, one of the big points in it is that space is supposed to be used as a resource for the benefit of humanity as a whole. And so the Moon Treaty kind of tried to focus more on fleshing that out, but it failed because none of the major space powers ended up signing it. I think a lot of the provisions in the Moon Treaty were almost like too specific and too restricting. And so like obviously if you've invested a lot into outer space, then you're not going to be incentivized to sign a treaty that says that you can't really benefit from any of the work you're doing. But yeah, since then there have not been any there have been some updates like to the Outer Space Treaty and additions, but as far as I'm aware, there's not really like a completely new updated agreement. But people have been talking for the last few years about how we kind of need to come together again and work on making a treaty for, I guess, this century, because there's so much that the treaties don't talk about that's really important to kind of flesh out. like, property rights, especially with like lunar or asteroid mining. In the next, or in the past like decade, we've discovered water on Mars, water on the moon. And so if a country ends up sending like a spacecraft there and they start mining those resources, like who do those resources belong to? Those are questions that have a lot of work to do, or that the international community still has to kind of answer. But obviously, most of these agreements are done through the United Nations, and the United Nations doesn't really have the best like enforcing power. I mean, they really don't have like enforcing power almost at all. So for an agreement really to be useful, it has to be something that all parties, that like benefits all parties. But yeah, sorry for that long tangent right there. I just find the international nature of space travel very interesting, since it's kind of like what I'm interested in studying. But so another thing that you guys have all heard about is the International Space Station. But actually the very first like space station that kind of went down in history was Mir. Mir was the first modular space station, and it was launched by the Soviet Union. I think Mir ended up falling into disrepair and like plummeting back to Earth in 2001. And part of that was because of, I guess, the fall of the Soviet Union and like the establishment of Russia instead. But Mir kind of gave a template or an example of a space station that could be created. And so people saw that it was successful as like a science station, and they're like, why don't we make one of these that's like bigger and that more parties can have a stake in? So NASA Roscosmos, which is Russia's like new and current space agency, also Jaxa, which is the Japanese space agency, the European Space Agency, and the Canadian Space Agency. So all of those different agencies came together to build the International Space Station. Construction of it started in 1998, and it's expected to continue functioning and serving humanity until about 2030. Although some people estimate, or I've heard some people say that they might repurpose or I guess decrease the use of it. But yeah, so the International Space Station was created to be a place in low Earth orbit where astronauts can go to live on for a period of, like, usually they stay on there for a long time, for like several months. And it's primarily established as a scientific lab. So there's a ton of like research experiments that have been conducted on the International Space Station with regards to, for example, like the human body and how the human body responds to lower gravity, to how the human body responds to increases in radiation. So the International Space Station has given us a lot of knowledge scientifically. So the International Space Station, I think, is a good representation of the era of exploration after the Apollo mission, because it stopped being quite so much about national pride and national identity as it became about scientific discovery. And that's why you have so many different like space agencies start to collaborate. And this collaboration has extended past even the International Space Station. As some state agencies lose funding or like lose abilities or change their mission, they've started depending on each other more. So I know, for example, like NASA used to rely on like Russian launch pads to be able to send astronauts to the space station. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting thing. But I think that's about all I had prepared about the International Space Station for now. Oh yeah, I meant to say, so another thing too is that beyond the United Nations and beyond projects like the International Space Station, there's been, I guess, an increase in the integration of the global space community, especially upon the advent of the internet. So there have been like a ton of different conferences that have come about, like the International Space Development Conference, that kind of try to bring in people from both public sectors in different countries, but also people from private sectors, which I'm going to talk about next. And so as a whole, the world has kind of started to come together more when it comes to addressing these challenges and, I guess, traveling to space. The one exception to that rule is kind of China. China has been kind of lone wolfing it for the most part during the last decade, going to space. China's space program is actually becoming really, really, really good, and it's becoming like kind of a big competitor to the USA and the European Space Agency and the Japanese Space Agency. So it's, yeah, part of the reason for that is because a lot of Western countries and a lot of like Russia and Japan too see China as a rising economic threat. And so a lot of people, or not a lot of people, a lot of countries like don't really want China to have a whole lot of power or infrastructure in space. So there's, it's kind of like a two-sided thing, you know, all parties have kind of contributed to that divide. But it'll be interesting to see whether this will develop into another sort of like Cold War-esque thing, especially since the US and China have become like economic competitors in other aspects too. But yeah. So the third part I'm going to talk about is privatization. Although the amount of competition between countries has significantly decreased, I think it's really interesting that within the last few decades, the rise of competition between private companies has actually risen a lot. So here are some of the companies, or I guess some of the dates that the companies started like being founded. A lot of the companies that are really, really huge today, like Blue Origin, SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, Made in Space, were founded at the beginning of the millennium. So it took them like a good 10 to 15 years to really become like super powerful. But as most of you guys probably know, all of these have become huge, huge names in the construction of materials to go to space and all that. So here's a cool, I guess, graphic of a lot of the really prominent companies in space right now. One of them that's really cool is called Made in Space, and they deal with like manufacturing things in space, especially with 3D printers. I think in 2014, I think it was 2014, where they actually 3D printed the first object in space. So manufacturing things outside of Earth isn't quite so far-fetched as you'd think it is. One cool thing about Made in Space too is that they, during the COVID-19 outbreak, they have devoted some of their like facilities to printing, I think, like masks and like the face guards. So that's kind of a cool little fact. But yeah, there's so many like private companies right now that it would take forever to go through all of them. But one thing that's kind of cool is that there have been a rise in smaller companies that have to do with space. So, for example, there's this organization called Space Angels, and it's an organization that tries to get investors to invest in entrepreneurial space companies. So definitely keep an eye out in the next decade or so, or even in the next few years, and try to see how many like new space companies you can see kind of rise out of all of this. It's very interesting. So if you haven't like heard as much about this before, you might wonder why privatization? Well, it's actually a lot cheaper for NASA to subcontract, and other space agencies too. It's cheaper for them to subcontract tasks or certain constructions to other companies. And the competition between companies for those contracts allows for more innovation and more, I guess, effectiveness in general. So like that competition eventually ends up lowering the price of space development and allows NASA to devote other resources elsewhere, like in fighting climate change or many of the other goals that they've come up with. So another thing too is that a lot of companies, by coming up with technologies that can be made or that can be used in space, a lot of those technologies can be applied on Earth, you know, like water purification techniques, for example. Or even like something as simple as the ballpoint pen was invented in space to account for like astronauts like ink going everywhere. But yeah, that's some of the reasons why the industry is becoming more privatized. There is a level of controversy though over this privatization. Some people believe that privatization could lead to like very bad things in the future if it's not tempered by government regulation, or I guess tempered by organizations like NASA, it's really important that we keep funding organizations like NASA, because obviously there's some instances where what might be good for one company, like to maximize the profits, might not necessarily be good for like space travel in general. And we'll get to some of those issues later, but yeah. Cool. So the fourth part of my presentation is talking mostly just about the future of space exploration. And that's my favorite part personally, because we're all going to be living in the future and experiencing a lot of these developments. So I don't know how many of you guys have heard about the Artemis mission, but it is this really, really cool mission that NASA has been working on developing in the past few years. And one thing that I like about it is the symbolicness of it. So Artemis in Greek mythology is the twin sister of Apollo, right? So first of all, it's kind of cool that they chose the twin sister name for that. But another thing that's kind of neat about Artemis is that they're focusing on more increased gender equity. So one of their goals, one of NASA's goals, is to bring the first woman to the moon in 2024. And so, like, I guess as a woman who's interested in the space industry, it's really neat to see that it's finally kind of, I guess, catching up, because in the 1960s and 70s, there actually were never any female astronauts who, like, from the US. Russia actually sent like a woman into space, and women have been going to the International Space Station and like doing spacewalks and all that. But this will be a pretty cool milestone in that respect. So another thing I really like about this page is that, so the Artemis mission is like going to the moon to prepare for Mars. So NASA and other scientists want to kind of create settlements on the moon where astronauts can kind of live and work there. And they want to experiment with a lot of the technology that we're going to need to survive on Mars. So I really like this picture because it shows the moon up close, but then Mars is in the background, which is very, very symbolic of the mission as a whole. So one thing that's also neat about Artemis is that NASA is really focusing on collaboration between commercial and international partners. So it's not just the US is going to Mars. It's not just we're trying to get the private industry to go to Mars. It's kind of a giant plan to get all of those different industries and sectors to work together. And another like really interesting feature of it is the Gateway Station. So if you haven't heard of it, the Gateway is this big spaceship that NASA wants to launch into orbit. And it's going to be basically an outpost around the moon. And from what I know, it's going to serve kind of like a gas station and a pit stop where like rockets and ships can stop to get fuel, or where they can stop and then like be launched to Mars. I'm not sure as much on the engineering aspects of it or the scientific aspects of it. I have a lot more research to do on that part, but it's an important part of the plan because we've never really had a like spaceship like that that's just like orbiting. Plus the name is so cool, like Gateway. How science fiction-y can you get? But yeah, if you're interested in learning more about the Artemis mission, I would check out NASA's plan for sustained lunar exploration and development. It was released either a few days or about a week ago, I don't remember. But NASA recently released this really more in detail plan about like the first phase of the Artemis mission. So if you're interested in that, go check it out. Let's see. And then I'm just gonna let this sit for a minute while I get some water. But this kind of shows a timeline, or like I guess the structure of the Artemis mission. You can find this graphic on the NASA website. So if you want to look at it for longer, go check that out. I love the NASA website. It's so aesthetic. Cool. So now that we've talked about the Artemis mission, the Apollo missions, the International Space Station, and everything, well, not everything else, but as many things as I could hit in this time, let's talk about the farther future. So in the long-term future, we've been talking about putting like a colony on Mars for a while. NASA currently, as far as I know, does not really have like a date that they plan on being on Mars, partially because they're using the moon as kind of an experimental time period. And so they don't really know what they're going to discover about man's ability to like live on another body for a long period of time. So the day or the time where we're projected to actually start colonies on Mars is pretty uncertain and it's pretty up in the air. But it is a goal eventually of NASA and of like other agencies. So another big thing though is that people have focused on is asteroid mining. And I don't know if any of you guys have heard, but there was this company called Planetary Resources. It started, I think, in the 2010s, in the early 2010s, and its goal was to send out probes and other, I guess, like spacecraft to go explore asteroids. A lot of asteroids have really like a bunch of materials like metals, minerals, etc. But the most important resource that asteroids often contain is ice. And one thing, and also one reason that scientists were so excited to discover like ice water on the moon is that ice can actually be converted to rocket fuel. So like if we eventually set up outposts where we mine asteroids, we'll have a lot greater access to exploring other areas of the solar system because it'll be easier to like, I don't know, manufacture fuel and to use that. So yep, asteroid mining is something that is on the far horizon. The company that I was talking about earlier actually ended up being absorbed by Consensus, which is like a satellite company from what I know. And so their mission temporarily has been derailed, and it kind of shows that asteroid mining is something that's probably not going to happen for a really long time. It's, I guess, a sector that is so hard to, like, it's so hard to establish manufacturing there that we need additional infrastructure on the moon and additional research before investors would be like actually willing to, you know, put up the money for it. But once once like the infrastructure is established, asteroid mining could become a very, very, very lucrative field. Some economists have said that asteroid mining could be like the first really trillion-dollar industry, which is pretty cool. Or I guess it could make the first trillionaire, one or the other. Anyways, it could make you really rich if you get into asteroid mining. Another thing is the search for extraterrestrial life and like the discovery of Goldilocks zone planets. That's kind of another one of NASA's big focuses, as many of you guys might know. Actually, NASA has released a lot of information and a lot of like activities that you can do at home if you're ever bored, you know, social distancing. So I would encourage everyone to go check that out. But yeah, we've also launched a lot more missions to explore the sun and to like better map the sun, better predict its behavior. So that's really important for human survival because obviously the sun is what keeps us all alive, you know, and a solar flare or a solar storm at the wrong time could be disastrous for life on Earth. So exploration of the sun is really important to protect the long-term, I guess, ecosystem of our planet, especially like the digital ecosystem. Another problem that is really important to consider that also kind of brings up a lot of what we talked about for the international aspect of it is space junk. So humans litter in space too, which is a problem. One problem that scientists and engineers are really grappling with right now is how to deal with all like the old satellites and stuff in space. Because if we get to the point where there's a certain level of clutter in space, it's going to eventually be impossible to launch vehicles outside of Earth. And so if we don't get this problem under control, future generations of humans may never be able to leave our planet, which is pretty sad. So that is a problem. I'm not going to expand upon it now because I want to leave some time for questions, but it's really, really interesting and it's really, really pressing. So, why is space important to explore and develop? A lot of the reasons I've kind of already mentioned or gone over. But if you're interested in reading more, I actually wrote an article for the UT Dallas Student Magazine. So I have a QR code right there, and I might send the link in the chat once I'm done screen sharing. But I wrote a long article about space environmentalism and why exploring and developing outer space is really important for the well-being of our planet. Some of the reasons are listed here. But yeah, that is my presentation. It took a little bit longer than I thought it would. I'm sorry for that, but I guess now I was going to open up for questions or discussions, or if any of you guys just want to chat, I'm down for that too.
Ciao, Cari.
Hi, Russ.
Hey, I had a couple questions actually. One in your wheelhouse about when you first talked about the international, basically legislative under the UN. Obviously, if you're in space and your government is putting a lot of money in towards it, you have a lot of skin in the game in making decisions about space. How do they balance those countries, obviously, that are just holding their country together? I mean, who has a say when it comes to making that kind of legislation? Who has more weight, that type of thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so all of the countries in the UN General Assembly kind of contribute to the Committee on Peaceful Uses for Outer Space. And the goal of that committee is not just to serve the interests of the countries that already have capabilities to explore space. The goal of that committee is to, I guess, increase the accessibility of space and to make sure that smaller countries or countries that don't have as developed space programs can benefit from it too. And so it's obviously right now a lot of the benefits that are coming from space, like science, like technology, and honestly, like the accolades of being a country that can go to space. A lot of that kind of only goes to countries that have those capabilities. But one thing that the committee is focused on, and what a lot of organizations are focused on, is building the infrastructure for space programs in other countries. But I hope I answered your question. It's kind of
Yeah, I mean, I think the conundrum, we even see it on a smaller scale around here when they put the train in. It was like and they bypassed some cities, but then some cities were like, oh, we want we want our 2 cents in on who controls the train. And you're like, wow, you weren't even willing to put up money to have it stop in your city. Now you want to control it. So,
yeah.
I think principles kind of play with space as well. My other question was why, or has the International Space Station been used as a way station, similar to how you described the gateway? I mean, I thought the biggest trouble is to escape the Earth's atmosphere, and then basically we go from there. I'm amazed, or I don't understand maybe some of the limitations as to why we just don't jump to the moon from the International Space Station.
Yeah, so the International Space Station is actually in lower Earth orbit, so it's not really it's the moon, I think I read, is 1,000 times farther away from Earth than the International Space Station, to give you some perspective. Okay. Another thing too, the International Space Station was designed primarily to function as a science lab, where humans can do experiments to prepare us for later voyages into space. So it doesn't really have the size or infrastructure to support that. The Gateway plan, so the Gateway ship, it's going to be much, much, much bigger, and it's also going to be a lunar outpost, so it's going to be a lot closer to the moon. And I guess those are some of the big differences and the reasons that we can't really use the space station as the gateway. The space station's also getting kind of old, so eventually it's going to probably be put into retirement.
And the discoveries and the science advancements made in the ISS, are they only shared with those countries that have a stake in that? In the ISS?
That's a good question. From what I know, which I could be wrong, a lot of especially because NASA, so the two primary countries that operate the space station are the US and Russia. Russia has a big part that's on its own, and then the US shares its part with the other the Japanese agency, the European agency and the Canadian one. But most of the entities that are using it, like NASA or the Canadian Space Agency, their goals are to disseminate this knowledge to the public. So from what I know, they like, because they're governmental organizations, right? They want to like benefit their populace.
Right.
So they try their best to, I think, share that information. I'm not sure how much of it is globally available. I do know that NASA and other agencies have tried to protect a lot of their technology from getting into the hands of China, because they're trying to like stifle their competition.
Sure.
But yeah, as for the actual scientific innovations, I like if they're innovations that benefit humankind, most of those agencies are compelled to share them.
My last question or comment has to deal with it's ironic that we talk about China being basically competitive with the rest of the world, or else the rest of the world's paranoid about China.
Mm-hmm.
One of the movies, The Martian, where they basically Damon's on Mars by himself, and there's this big moment in the movie where there's this collaboration between China and the U.S. to borrow one of their rockets so they can fuel that spaceship to get back to Mars. And I just think there's a bit of irony there that Hollywood pandered to China in that sense, but yet the reality is there's no collaboration between space agencies.
One thing, though, that is like important to point out, one of the things that was later added on to the Outer Space Treaty is this provision that says that all nation states are compelled to try to save the lives of any astronauts or any human life in space. So maybe that's where the movie got it from. Maybe if the Chinese space agency had the capabilities to actually help get a man back, under at least that part of the treaty, they would be compelled to do so. Although it's not like anyone can really enforce it.
Sure. Yeah. No, I just remember that part of the movie where the Chinese questioned themselves and said, well, nobody knows we have this capability. And they're like, yeah, but at some point history's going to know. And so then they benevolently decided to share their technology. And I was like, oh, isn't that a Hollywood?
It might not be that unrealistic.
Yeah.